Welcome to Missing Chronicles, where we delve into the heartbreaking and enigmatic mysteries surrounding disappearances. Here, we will immerse ourselves in the world of unsolved cases, thrilling search efforts, and intricate journeys. The goal of this channel is to spread awareness, foster community connections, and provide support to the families and loved ones of the missing. Join me as we embark on a suspenseful journey, hoping to uncover the truth behind these missing chronicles. Help us sustain and grow Missing Chronicles by becoming a patron on Patreon. Your contribution ensures that we can continue our investigations, share compelling stories, and work towards a world where no one is forgotten. Join us in making a lasting impact today. Missing People: The UFO Connection, Unraveling the Mystery Behind Unexplained Disappearances. The first missing persons case involves Charles Dwayne Gustafson, a hunter who disappeared in the Medicine Bowen National Forest. The second case is about Mark Anthony Strittmatter, also a hunter, who likewise vanished in the Medicine Bowen National Forest. UFO-related incidents include an abduction of wild elk in Washington in 1999 and a UFO abductee who was the centerpiece of the trailer, a man named Carl Higdon. Mr. Higdon claims to have been abducted by aliens while hunting in none other than the Medicine Bowen National Forest. Mr. Higdon's story is nothing short of intriguing, so let's delve into exactly what he says happened to him in 1974. At the time, Carl Higdon was 40 years old and a veteran oil driller. On October 25, he left home to pick up his crew so that they could go to work, only to find that all of them were sick that day. Carl decided to take the day off and spend it elk hunting instead. Carl grabbed a rifle from his home and began driving to McCarty Canyon. On the way, he encountered some hunters whose truck had broken down on the roadside. The hunter suggested that Carl try hunting in the Medicine Bowen National Forest, and this is what he decided to do. Carl eventually parked his truck and ran into a local game warden with whom he chatted briefly. He then wandered off into the forest before coming to a clearing where he saw 5 elk. He then took his rifle and aimed at one of the bulls before firing, but there was no sound of a gunshot. When he fired, the 7mm Magnum round that came out of his rifle moved slowly through the air before dropping to the ground as if gravity itself was being affected by some unknown force. Carl picked up the spent rifle shell and put it in his pocket. Then he suddenly became aware of a man approaching him from behind, but this was no ordinary human being. Carl described him as being around 6 feet tall with straw-like hair that stood straight up, as well as 2 long strands that appeared to be antennas. The being had no noticeable chin, a yellowish skin tone, and small eyes with no eyebrows. He was dressed in a black suit reminiscent of a wetsuit and had bowed legs. He also wore a wide belt with a 6-pointed star emblem on it. Carl was unable to see if the being had any hands and instead noticed that there were 2 tapered rod-like appendages. It appeared to Carl that the being could control the force of gravity with these rod-like hands. The being asked Carl if he was hungry, and Carl replied that he was. The being then floated a pack of pills over to Carl and told him to take one. With the feeling that all of his willpower had suddenly been removed, Carl did as he was told and took the pill. The being then asked Carl if he would like to go with them, and Carl said that he would. Suddenly, Carl was transported into a clear, cube-like object that he had noticed on the ground not far from the alien being. He was then strapped to a chair, and he noticed the 5 elk were in there with him, though they were motionless, almost like they had been sedated. Carl could see his pickup truck on the ground through the clear walls of the cube ship, and he realized that it had been rising into the air. 2 additional beings placed a helmet on Carl's head that had wires sticking out of it. One of them waved a hand and everything disappeared, and all Carl could see was a blue ball, then a blinding bright light. He began to see a tower that reminded him of the Seattle Space Needle. Below it were what appeared to be humans. 2 aliens then began taking Carl down a long hallway. They did not walk, though, they floated. Inside a large room, the aliens gave Carl some form of examination and eventually told him that he was not what they wanted and they would be returning him to where he came from. Carl was once again bathed in a blindingly bright light. Carl was then introduced to a being named Alzo-1, who informed him that he would be taking him back home. Also one told Carl how they had been coming to Earth for many years in order to take fish and wild game. They used the Earth animals to make their food, which was in pill form. Also one also mentioned that all the oceans on the alien planet were yellow and all the fish had died. The alien also explained that they were 163,000 light-years away from Earth, that he was also a hunter, and that his people wore black suits to protect them from the Earth's Sunday. The next thing Carl knew, he was hovering over a forest and he was floating down towards the ground outside of the alien craft. Carl fell to the ground in pain. He saw a sign that said, North Boundary Lincoln Forest. Carl didn't know where he was but began walking as darkness was quickly approaching. He soon stumbled upon his pickup truck where he climbed inside and just sat. Carl heard someone speaking through the two-way radio in his car, but he couldn't remember how to work it. In fact, he couldn't even remember how to drive. Carl eventually figured out the radio enough to get a hold of someone. He began rambling to the man about how he didn't know where he was or what he was doing, about the strange men in black suits, and about being incredibly cold. Around this time, Carl's boss called his wife, Marjorie, to tell her that they were talking to a man on the company radio who they believed to be Carl, but he was not making any sense. The local sheriff was contacted, and using information gathered from the game warden who had spoken to Carl earlier in the day, they were able to pick a search location. Searchers on the ground noticed the sky was unusually bright for nighttime, almost like the sun was rising. Marjorie and other searchers found Carl's pickup that same night and came across Carl in a rather frantic state, still rambling about the people who took his elk. The truck was found stuck in a muck hole with no noticeable tracks leading to it. They decided to take Carl to Carbon County Memorial Hospital. Once there, they noticed Carl's eyes were watering profusely, his shoulder was hurting, and he was talking about floating pills. Carl talked to the doctor on call about his 163,000 light-year journey. The doctor subsequently ordered Carl to be drug tested. The lights in the room had to be turned off because Carl's eyes were so sensitive. The doctor eventually determined that Carl had no broken bones and tested negative for drugs. Carl's wife reported that the diagnosis was amnesic shock. Doctors kept Carl for observation as he still could not remember his name or recognize his wife. Marjorie gave Carl a pencil and paper to write down all he could remember, and Carl ended up drawing a picture of the being he saw and also the words Ender and Saltillo Street. Marjorie would go home and later find the shell casing fired from Carl's rifle. It was in a mangled state. She later showed the item to the local sheriff, who said it appeared to be a shell casing turned inside out. Carl's memory returned when his daughter visited him in the hospital. Carl would go on to tell his story to newspapers and psychologists. One of these men, Dr. R. Leo Sprinkle, put Carl into a state of hypnosis in order to have him remember his ordeal. Sprinkle indicated that he believed Carl was being genuine in the telling of his story. Later on, Carl would attribute some beneficial health effects to the incident. He no longer got kidney stones and no longer had scarring on his lungs that was previously there. The spent shell casing then disappeared from a safe at the University of Wyoming. Carl Higdon's story is without a doubt bizarre, but like many stories of UFO abduction, it is difficult to verify. There were many witnesses to the events both preceding and after the abduction, which certainly adds credibility. The incident was well publicized shortly after, and Carl's wife would go on to write a book about the event. On the skeptical side of things, the description of the alien itself is rather bizarre, but perhaps that is simply to be expected of a being from another world. It's interesting, though, that in some ways the description resembles that of an Andorian from Star Trek, which began airing in 1966. Some other details also feel questionable, like the fact that Carl claims he was inside a 7-foot by 7-foot cubicle with 2 aliens and 5 adult elk. The logistics of that don't make much sense, but then again, we are talking about beings who can control gravity, so who knows what's possible. Perhaps Carl's visual measurement of the space was simply off. The idea that alien beings traveled over 100,000 light-years in order to capture a handful of elk to feed their planet is also hard to grasp. Would a people who are so technologically advanced really be so desperate for food that they are forced to hunt for it on Earth, and so far away, it's also interesting to note that Carl admitted that he had previously told his wife that if he ever encountered alien beings from another world, he would talk with them or go with them. That is a pretty unusual thing to say or even be thinking about, and puts his claims under even greater scrutiny. Ultimately, the story is whatever you want to make of it. Now, I assume that this incident will perhaps be used in the new Missing 411 movie to connect to or explain other disappearances that have occurred in the Medicine Bowen National Forest and also the abduction of wild game by UFOs. First, let's cover the Medicine Bowen National Forest cases, Charles Gustafson and Mark Strittmatter. So, what do we know about these two cases? Well, first, I can tell you that the Carbon County Sheriff, Archie Roy Bell, is pretty tight-fisted with his case files for both. I contacted his office for the release of both case files and was denied. I attempted to appeal the decision directly to Sheriff Roy Bell himself, but was once again rejected. Before anyone thinks that's strange, though, I just want to say that I run into that pretty often. Both cases are currently unsolved with no body having been found. Law enforcement doesn't like it when they don't have a body. The case can appear as straightforward as anything, but if they haven't found at least one bone, some sheriffs are hesitant to release anything. So, here is what is currently public about both cases. 72-year-old Charles Gustafson went on a hunting trip to the Medicine Bowen National Forest with his cousin and nephew on October 10, 2006. The group was said to have made camp about 8 miles south of Arlington. The first day of their hunt, the three fanned out in different directions. Charles ended up getting lost on this day, but luckily he ran into a logger who was able to help get him back to his camp. The others in his group would later tell the sheriff that it seemed Charles was having orientation problems, possibly due to the altitude. Despite this rather troubling development, the group went hunting the next day as well. Again, they all fanned out in different directions, and once again, Charles must have become lost. He never returned back to camp. One of Charles's relatives said that they fired 3 shots in the air and said they heard 3 shots fired in response, presumably by Charles. After that, there was no further sign of him. The Carbon County Sheriff was notified, and they had searchers in the area on foot, horseback, and ATVs. Night temperatures at the time were in the 30s, and a snowstorm hit the area the following week, which grounded search helicopters. Quite a few inches of snow was dropped on the ground during this time. Charles had been in the Air Force when he was young and had even been an instructor in survival training, but his age and possible mental decline, whether it be from altitude or something else, likely played a large role in his disappearance. To this day, Charles has still not been found. 44-year-old Mark Anthony Strittmatter was heading into the Medicine Bowen National Forest to go hunting on October 19, 2019, he was last seen on surveillance cameras at the Come and Go in Saratoga, Wyoming, around 5:45 a.m. At 11 a.m., he sent a text message to his girlfriend. This was the last time anyone had any contact with Mark, and he was reported missing the next day. His truck was later found on Forest Road 801. The weather in the area was especially bad while Mark was lost, with temperatures reportedly going below zero along with snowstorms. The initial search for Mark included people on foot, canines, and aerial drones, but nothing of value was found. The following year, a hunter found a pair of binoculars about 600 yards from where the truck had been parked. Authorities searched the area and turned up some other small items believed to be Mark's. But he remains missing to this day. Viewed collectively, can we draw any sort of conclusion from these incidents? Could what happened to Carl Higdon also have happened to Gustafson and Strittmatter? I would be very skeptical, if for no other reason than because we know very little about both of these missing persons cases, and the sheriff at this time is unwilling to say what they know. These cases also don't necessarily jive with the Higdon incident, where the claim is that the aliens came down to take wild game back to their planet for food. Because of this, I'm not sure we can say there's anything especially strange going on in Medicine Bow. The next thing I want to mention is the elk abduction incident referenced in the trailer that reportedly occurred in Washington in 1999. Information on this incident is difficult to find, and I could not track down any original newspaper clippings of the incident, aside from a column written by a man in 1999 who simply relays the story that was posted online. The incident seems to have been solely reported to UFO investigators. In some instances, I've read the men involved were loggers, in others, they were state forestry workers planting trees. Either way, the incident goes something like this. On February 25, 1999, 3 men in the Mount St. Helens area noticed a disc-shaped object come into their field of view, moving very purposefully and silently as it flew through the air. The workers called to the rest of their crew, possibly more than 11 men, and the group watched a bizarre scene play out. The UFO flew over to a herd of elk that were grazing nearby and began hovering over them. The elk began to get agitated, and soon one of them became separated from the rest. The UFO zeroed in on this lone elk and began lifting it into the air using some sort of invisible tractor beam. The UFO began to ascend as the elk started moving closer and closer to the disc itself. The object then began to head off towards the east at a high rate of speed, presumably taking the elk up inside it. On March 1, the incident was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center, who then contacted MUFON to lead the investigation. MUFON spoke to the 3 main witnesses and went to the location itself. The corpse of an elk was reportedly found on the roadside a few miles away from the abduction site. While nobody could say whether this was the same elk, they were shocked to discover that it had no obvious signs of injury, and for 8 days, no other predatory animals had touched it. I could see where someone would look at the Higdon incident and the elk abduction in 1999 and make a connection, but I believe the 2 incidents are actually less similar than people may think. Sure, they both involve the taking of elk by a UFO, but consider the purpose. In the Higdon incident, Carl said the aliens took 5 elk because they wanted to use them for food. In the Washington incident, which occurred 25 years later, the UFO took a single elk from an entire group. The MUFON investigators believe that same elk was dropped back down onto the earth, dead. If this UFO wanted to use the elk for food purposes, you would think it would have taken all of them, much less take one and return it dead. Incidents of UFOs taking or mutilating animals have been reported for a long time, and I could go on forever about the numerous theories I've heard regarding why these animals would be taken. The simple truth is, we don't know. Not a very satisfying conclusion, I admit, but it is the fact of the matter. Perhaps the new Missing 411 movie will have some interesting interviews with eyewitnesses or families surrounding these events. Thank you for watching Missing Chronicles. We have explored captivating stories and searched for answers behind the vanished. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to stay updated with our latest videos. Share these videos to spread the message and assist affected families and loved ones. If you have any information related to the cases we've discussed, please leave them in the comments section. Together, we can make a difference. See you in the next Missing Chronicles.